Hello, thank you again for giving me this opportunity to talk here today at the Econ Club. I know we all are quite busy this summer, but I decided to call this emergency meeting because I was at Ratner a few hours ago, and the guy next to me on my treadmill was talking to his broker. He was sweating quite a bit. He was receiving what we call a margin call. And it was one of the first times that I've ever heard someone receive this call. I've only heard about it in my finance courses before. So today, I thought it would be really interesting to share with you some of my research that I've been doing on futures and forward markets. In particular, the futures in oil and commodity. I think it's a really interesting topic. And as we know, we're in Chicago right now. Chicago is the World Trade Center for commodities trading and also for futures trading. So yeah, I think this is going to be a great topic. So to begin, we all know about the spot market. The spot market is the current market price for any good or service right now for immediate delivery. Whereas forward and futures markets involve delivery over the course of time, not right now. So why is this important, you may ask? Well, think about it. If you're a farmer and you're growing wheat or rice, you don't really know what the price of your produce is going to be, especially with agricultural produce. They swing widely. So you decide, okay, I'm going to choose a particular price and I'm going to lock in at this price to reduce any concerns about the price of the crop falling in the future. So you enter into what we call a forward contract. Let's say you're a farmer selling wheat, you might enter it with a cereal manufacturer, you enter a forward agreement. And you agree that at this particular date in the future, I as a farmer will sell you my produce at this quality, at this amount, at this time, for this specific amount of price. So that's first of all what a forward market is. Futures markets, on the other hand, they're very similar actually. But if you think about it, between the farmer and the warehouse, there's a great deal of uncertainty. The warehouse doesn't know that the farmer, for whatever reason, might not be able to deliver the crop at that time. There's a great deal of risk there. So futures market steps in to help mitigate that risk a little bit. Essentially what we do is we have an exchange now where anyone, you and me, can enter into this exchange. And even though we're not farmers, we have nothing to do with the wheat or rice business, we can enter into a futures contract at ease. So I began this by talking about the margin calls, and margins play a big role in the futures market. Essentially, when you enter into a futures contract, you have this margin account, which gets topped up, it gets credited or debited each day, depending on how the price of your security changes. And if the price of your security drops below a certain level, you will receive a margin call from your broker. And it's really quite a scary call. You're left with either two options, which is to force sale, you have to sell, close out your position, or you have to top up your margin account. So it's actually quite a really clever financial innovation if you think about it. And I was surprised when I was reading it, I discovered it was invented in Japan in the 1670s in Dojima. Back then, it was really loud on the trading center. They used hand signals to communicate whether they were buying or selling. They even had a man coming around to pour water at people when the time for trading had ended. So I mentioned at the beginning that I really wanted to talk about oil futures and forwards. But before we do that, you guys might be interested in other futures markets which exist. One of them is the currency market. So you might enter into a futures market for currency if you're unsure about whether the value of your currency will go up or down. Essentially, it's not quite the same, but it's similar to if I'm a Thai business in the US and I'm scared that the US dollar will devalue, I might decide, okay, I'm going to borrow from US banks, pay them the US interest rates that they charge, exchange that principal amount into Thai baht, place it in a Thai bank, and receive the Thai interest rate on that. So then there's a spread between the interest rate earns, and you're essentially hedging against the risk of a currency devaluation there. So that's one area. And then also, whilst researching, and a lot of you here might find that this really interesting if you're on the Fed Challenge team, is there's a futures market for the federal funds rates. And it's actually really accurate. If you take a look at the past trends, it tends to, due to arbitrage, it tends to converge on the actual federal funds rate and does quite a good job of predicting it. Now, the futures market, which really interests me, is the oil futures market. So I thought we'd spend some time discussing that. So oil, think about it. Oil is either being distributed through pipelines or it's underground. It's very rarely taken out and stored because clearly there's a storage cost, which is expensive. So what we find is that oil is not usually represented in spot markets. We tend to quote oil prices in the nearest futures price instead because it represents a longer term contract, not a short term one. So the key point I want to get across here is that when you enter into oil futures or forwards, you have to understand that the price of oil, it's actually affected by a range of factors. There's politics, geopolitics, war, organizations such as OPEC, supply, demand. So really, before you enter into a futures contract in commodities, you need to understand the history, the relations between countries, and I wanted to just briefly go through some of that here today, focusing specifically on oil and energy. So before 1891, here in the US, the government controlled the price of oil. There was barely any change for hundreds of years. There was barely any change in the oil prices until the first oil crisis. The reason that crisis came about, we'll talk about later, but one of the factors was that the US themselves had over-extracted and ran out of their own supply of oils. Then came OPEC in the 60s. Essentially, these group of countries, I think it was Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia got together. And they said that, with militant leaders, with undemocratic leaders, we're not really sure. They might suddenly decide to pump oil one day and drop the price significantly because they don't care that about the oil supplies going forward. It's got nothing to do with them. They're just concerned with their political agenda at the moment. So it's very volatile. And they wanted to form this cartel essentially to fix the price of oil to ensure their own profitability. The first oil crisis, and I'm sure you've all heard about this, was in 1973 to 4, during the Yom Kippur War, when essentially the Arab countries and OPEC decided to stop exporting oil because of US support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. So essentially OPEC cut supplies, the price of oil immediately soared, there was a worldwide recession, there was high inflation and fuel costs. It really was a bad time. Then the second oil crisis was in 1979 to 1980, when in Iran, Shah Pahlavi was ousted and replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini. Then again, there was the Iran-Iraq war. Following that, prices soared immediately. Again, CPI out of the roof because of reduced production from Iran. Then another key significant event was 1986, I believe, when there was some political struggles within OPEC. Essentially, with a cartel, it's quite hard to manage. Some countries are overproducing, some countries are underproducing. There's geopolitical tensions between countries, and so it's sort of collapsed during that time. And the list goes on. The invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in 1990s. In 2003, we had the Second Gulf War. Saddam Hussein was ousted. All these essentially impact the price of oil. So when you enter into a futures contract, you really have to be mindful of what's going around in the world as well. After the 2008 financial crisis was that we came in with new innovations in order to protect ourselves against these high oil prices. We developed fracking here in the US in particular. Fracking is when we have these rocks which have oils inside. We essentially pump high water and sand and inject it into the rock, and that's how we extract the oil and gas from the rocks. And this was revolutionary, leading to decreased oil prices over time. And the list goes on. 2011 Arab Spring. Even COVID-19 caused a drop in oil prices. Even 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine caused significant price rises around the world. So the list really goes on, and we see how forwards market, futures market, especially in commodities, we really have to be well rehearsed in these geopolitical tensions and in history, not just in finance. So I was really glad when I heard my fellow treadmill person struggling about margins call. Not glad, I was sorry for him, but it really gives me the opportunity to share with you today that in the future, if we may decide to open a venture together to work at the stock exchange, mercantile exchange, that we have some knowledge about how we're going to go about doing that. So thank you again for your time.